always work that easy for me. Well, welcome everyone. What I felt like I really wanted to do was just talk about Israel's War of Independence, because the sad fact of the matter is that many Israelis have no idea what happened or how the War of Independence came about to be, was fought and won. It's just we live here and we don't study this enough in our school systems. Most Olim or immigrants will never learn about this unless they pick up a book or study the history, because we don't go through the Israeli school system if you're over, say, age 20 or so. Therefore, I think many of us who are here today immigrated in our older years, so this might all be new. And if it is, enjoy it very much. If you're just joining in because you love Israel, I commend you, and hopefully this will be fun for you as well. So Israel's War of Independence. Again, I wanted to do this because I think many Israelis and just people in general have no idea about how our nation was born. For me, the time period and the war itself was a time of bravery, suffering, as the slide says, of being alone in the world, and a time of great courage, of great victory that came at a very high cost. 6,000 Israelis died in the War of Independence, which was a full 1% of the population of the new Jewish state. That's a pretty heavy casualty percentage as wars go. It was a time of birth through war, a time of birth through sacrifice and giving. When I hear the stories of some of the people who fought in the IDF, I just admire their bravery, their courage, and their giving. And it was a time of being a tremendous underdog, obviously, and a time of many miracles. And I'm going to emphasize that part of things as we talk about it today, because I can't imagine that the War of Independence would have ever lasted more than one day had it not been for the fact that God must have been watching over the people of Israel. So it was a time of courage. Just as a bit of background from 1917 to 1948, what today is the nation of Israel was officially part of what was called mandated Palestine. This came about to be because the League of Nations, which was before the United Nations, but the League of Nations gave it the name mandated Palestine and allowed the United Kingdom to control the area that are the nations of Israel and Jordan of today. This came on the heels of World War I, when the world didn't really know what to do with it. And since Britain had taken both Israel and Jordan out of the hands of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations decided that Britain could rule over the area, basically. So from 1917 through 1948, it was the UK that was administrating and governing what we know of Israel and Jordan today. On the 29th of November, 1947, in Hebrew, we call it Kaftet November. It's a holiday in Israel today. The new United Nations, which had been around for 2 years now, voted to create a Jewish state and an Arab state in the mandated area, meaning what we know of today as Israel and Jordan. All the Arab nations in the world at the time opposed this decision. So we had an immediate problem, right? You're going to create a Jewish state and an Arab state, but no Arab nations are going to recognize any Jewish state. On the 4th of May, 1948, Britain left governing over Israel and Jordan, left the mandated area. And on that day, Israel declared its independence as the Jewish state. So in real short order, these are the dates of when the nation of Israel was born, and basically how it came about in terms of who was here before. Now, one question I want to ask is, did not the prophet Isaiah talk about this day? We'll read from Isaiah 66, verses 7, 8, and 9. Before she goes into labor, she gives birth. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen such things like this? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment. Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. Do I bring to the moment of birth and not give delivery, says Adonai. So for the first time in 2,000 years, on May 14th, 1948, the Galut, the diaspora, ended, and there was an independent Jewish state in Israel. Our national anthem has the clause in it, the hope that's 2,000 years old. So this was really a dream of the Jewish people for nearly 2,000 years that came about to be almost overnight as the British left. Nobody knew whether or not Israel would declare its independence. There were some people in the land here in Israel who were working so that Israel wouldn't declare its independence, but wanted other entities to run what we call the nation of Israel today. But stroke of boldness, I'll talk about later who it was who declared that we would become a state. But with every birth that is happening, there's an enemy lurking to prevent the birth of the Jewish nation. This is symbolic. I don't know that Revelation chapter 12 actually is referring to this event of the birth of the modern state of Israel, but you'll get the imagery. From Revelations 12, starting at verse 2, she was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. This is kind of the idea you get, that the nation of Israel is being born, and there are 5 armies perched on the border of the state that was just declared, ready to pounce on her and end the nation the same day that it was born. That's pretty rarely the case in the history of the world. So let's ask the question, why did 5 Arab nations try to violently prevent the Jewish state from being born? I can think of 5 reasons. There might be more, but one of them is historic anti-Semitism. Jews were subject persons, which is the concept of dhimmi in Arabic, for 1,300 years in the Muslim-dominated Middle East, and a Jewish independent state would rock and shake the boat for what has been. And for any new kind of innovation, if there's a boat shaking, there are going to be people opposing it because they like the status quo. Secondly, we have the Islamic concept of waqf. Waqf states this: if a Muslim government ever ruled over an area, it remains Muslim property forever. And you might know that the land of Israel was ruled once by the Umayyad rulers, who were Muslims and Arab. And so there were those in the Arab world who believed that Israel was waqf. There can't be a Jewish state there. It must always remain Muslim dominated. Thirdly, and this is a reason I hear a lot today and still defended today, a lot of anti-Jewish state Arabs back then as well as today say this: why should we pay for what the Nazis did? I put sic by it, that is Latin for that's very erroneous kind of reasoning. But that you could have heard in 1948. Hey, the Nazis did all the damage to the Jews. Why should we have to give them land and pay for what the Nazis did? Fourthly, there was a political hope of a pan-Arab state, meaning one Arab nation across the entire Middle East. Both Egypt and Syria were working to do that. The plans later fell apart, but this would need to include Israel in its area. So there were those who backed that plan, and Israel would get in their way. Lastly, if there was any moderate Arab voices for coexistence with the Jewish state, they were quashed and not expressed and not allowed to exist. So for those 5 reasons, Israel found itself, as it was being born, about to be swallowed up. On the 14th of May, 1948, a 3-pronged war broke out, and there were 3 main stages of battle. This is the War of Independence as we know it today. Now, I don't want to mislead you because the War of Independence actually began in November 1947. I'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, we have the Battle for Jerusalem, which was the main theater of the war. the new Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said, we must not have Jerusalem fall. Jerusalem's the soul of the Jewish state. If she falls to the Arab armies, our new state is ended. That's what he said. And so the battle for Jerusalem might have been the key battle in the War of Independence. And that took place from November of 1947, before the state was born, which is funny, until June of 1948. So, okay, that's one of the prongs of the war. The second one was trying to secure the city of Tel Aviv, because that's where Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was running the government from, and the Galilee, the Galilee as we say in Hebrew, and the Negev regions. And that war took place, battles for that area took place from the spring to fall of 1948. So that was the second, third, and fourth theater for the war. And this would, of course, be the heartland of Israel. So we're looking up here at Galilee, and we're looking here at the Midland region, where Tel Aviv is right here. And the Negev region, then we're looking toward Beersheba down here. Those are the three chunks that Israel was given by the United Nations to start her state, as well as half of Jerusalem. So there was also a third prong of the war down here at the very bottom where Eilat is, and that was the drive south to the Red Sea, which took place on those dates that you see in 1949. So these were the three real pushes of the war. Each was a stage of the war. Each really had to be completed successfully for the new state to be born. Okay, so again, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, that both a Jewish and Arab state were approved at the United Nations. The vote was 33-13, 10 abstentions. The United States, not surprisingly, voted for the new Jewish state to exist. The Soviet Union also voted for it to exist, hoping that, because the Soviet Union knew that Israel had a socialist government at first, they were hoping to convince the new socialist government to be under the influence of the Soviet kind of all her satellites. But of course, that fell short immediately. Britain, funny enough, that had ruled in the area, abstained. You want to know why? Because Britain was more interested in having access to the oil reserves that they knew existed in the Middle East. And they figured if they voted yes, they'd be in trouble with the Arab states where the oil was. And they didn't want to vote no, because they're the ones who passed the Balfour Declaration back in 1917, stating that a Jewish state should exist. So they were kind of felt trapped between the two. Okay, so Arab forces began a blockade of the roads around Jerusalem almost immediately after the 29th of November, 1947. So the war really begins then. On the 29th of November, 1947, there's a photo of people in Tel Aviv after the United Nations announced its vote that there was going to be a Jewish state, breaking out in song and dance all over the city. David Ben-Gurion, the new prime minister, who had previously been the head of the Histadrut, which is our largest labor union. He went from there, being the secretary, to prime ministership. Here's what he said upon seeing from his apartment all the people dancing and bursting forth happily on the 29th of November. He said this, let them dance, but I weep because I know tomorrow that we must begin to fight. So he had no illusions that being born was going to be easy. And sure enough, although there wasn't an official war declared, what happened was that the battle for Jerusalem began immediately. Now, the numbers game wasn't encouraging for the new state of Israel. There were 650,000 Jewish people living in the new state. 88,000 were soldiers. And that was going to go against 5 states with a combined population of 40 million people. So we're talking about Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, as well as an irregular army from Israel. So if you look at the possibility of having resources, the little tiny Jewish state was far out-resourced by these 5 states. As well, there were British military advisors who stayed after the British left, stayed in Arab countries to advise them on how to beat the Jews when they tried to get free Two amongst them in particular were General John Glove and General Clayton. And therefore, the British had good military advice as well. So the odds didn't look that great. The Jewish military forces in 1947, when the blockade around Jerusalem started and the war really gets going in earnest, there wasn't one Jewish army, and that was a real big problem. There were three Jewish armies, and they didn't like each other. So in order to win a war, you have to unite the three. That eventually happens. But let me take you back to November 1947, as Jerusalem is beginning to be blockaded by the Arab population of Israel. Here's what the Jewish forces looked like. There was the Haganah, which was a kibbutz-centered defense militia. Their doctrine was, we only fight in defense of our towns and our farms. They were commanded directly by David Ben-Gurion, who had some ability in terms of military knowledge. Some of their notable officers were Yitzhak Rabin, who later was a prime minister, Moshe Dayan, who many of you know is the eye-patched military minister of defense, who we had here in Israel when Golda Meir was the prime minister. Moshe Dayan, okay, so Yaakov Dori is the next one. He was one of our chief of staffs of the Israeli military. So these were people who were famous in the Haganah. We could include Golda Meir, although she wasn't active in the Haganah, as being somebody who was involved in this circle of people. So we have prime ministers and military leaders there. The Irgun was the second Jewish force that existed. Haganah was the largest one. The Irgun was maybe half the size of the Haganah. It was a city-centered militia, not kibbutz or farm-centered. Most of its members were city boys instead of farm boys. They were part of a political organization that wanted to drive out the British military that was ruling here up till 1948. So that could open up Aliyah, or immigration, to Israel. They were sick and tired of seeing what happened during World War II, when Jewish people tried to leave Europe for Israel and got turned back. They felt that was a crime, such a horrible thing. They didn't mind trying to kick the British out by using force, because the British were not allowing any more than 75,000 Jews a year to immigrate to Israel. I think of 6 million Jews dying, 75,000 a year, the immigration quota that the British allowed. So of course, the people of the Irgun were going to feel negative about that and try to do something about it. They were commanded by Menachem Begin, who later became a prime minister of Israel. Some other notable leaders were David Raziel. He was the first military commander of the Irgun. Menachem Begin took over his role. Avraham Tahomi was the founder of the Irgun. Believe it or not, just after the War of Independence, he moved to Washington, D.C., from where he made Aliyah to Israel, and he stayed there the rest of his life, which is a little bit droll, I think, given the fact that he was one of the real founders of the state. Yaakov Meridor, later a Knesset member, was in the Irgun, and Shmuel Katz, who was a very prominent Israeli, as well as a Knesset member later on, also was a member of the Irgun. The third group was called Lehi. They were a break-off militia from the Irgun. Some of their notable officers were Abraham Stern, Geula Cohen, who later became a Knesset member. That's a woman's name, and she was a military leader of the group. And Yitzhak Shamir, the little diminutive man who was one of our prime ministers. So there were these three organizations. Like I said, the Irgun and Lehi did not get along with the Haganah. However, on the 26th of May, 1948, the IDF, which is Israel's army today, was officially founded. In August 1948, the Irgun decided to disband and join the IDF as part of one united army, because till then, most of the War of Independence from November until August in 1947, 1948, the Jews fought with three armies. And again, I don't know how they did so well, but they did, and we'll see some of the reasons why. So the military unity that then took place in the summer of 1948 was very positive. And above are some of the photos of some of the people we talked about. So I'll introduce you to them if I can get this out of the way. There we go. On the left, we have Avraham Tahomi, who was the founder of the Irgun. Next to him on the right, I'm going left to right here, is Menachem Begin, who was the leader of the Irgun during World War II and afterwards, and became our prime minister. Margalit and I had the privilege of meeting him in 1980. Anyhow, Prime Minister Begin was wanted by the British authority during World War II as a person who was subversive. And so, you know how he stayed out of their hands and was able to command the Irgun during World War II. He was never found by the British, never arrested, and he, from behind the scenes, operated the Irgun organization. He did it by growing out his payout, which are religious side curls that Jewish men wear, grew his beard really long, put on a big kippah or yarmulke, and he spent a lot of his time in the central synagogue in Tel Aviv, in the synagogue. And from that synagogue, he basically ran the Irgun organization. And the British never thought that the very rabbi-looking man who was in there all the time was Menachem Begin. So he was left alone. To his right is Moshe Dayan, who we mentioned before, later became Israel's Minister of Defense under Golda Meir, and he was also very prominent in the Haganah. He was trained by Ord Wingate, who some of you might know, was a very famous British captain who trained the Haganah at night in the 1930s. And on the far right is Abraham Stern, not well liked because he believed in using violence to get the British out. But he said, you know, the bigger picture is that we're losing people to the Nazis, and if we can't get fast and quick aliyah, with the British sponsoring it, we have to get the British out, otherwise Jews are going to die. And he was right about that. So before the uniting of the three groups of the Haganah, of the Irgun and Lehi, there had been again enmity between them, and it got so bad that in 1945, during World War II, the Haganah, that was the largest organization centered in the kibbutzes, had a time which was called the hunting season, when they were capturing and turning in Irgun members to the British police. Why? They feared that the British were going to clamp down really hard against the Haganah if the Irgun continued its operations, because the Irgun, again, didn't mind doing things like blowing up British military bases, going into them and trying to steal weapons. They did things like that because of the urgency of the hour for saving Jewish life. So the Haganah, again, just feeling itself just being a defensive organization, as they explain themselves, betrayed their kinsmen to avoid the British cracking down even harder. And the Haganah looked at that as being something that would be detrimental to the entire population of 650,000 people. Plus, the British were fighting the Nazis. So why should we fight against an ally who's trying to save the Jewish people in Europe and get them angry with us? They were afraid this might hurt us after the war, meaning World War II. And if we have a war of independence, then the British might pull away from supporting us should we give them too many problems right now. So those are all the fears that went into why the Haganah did what it did. Okay, next slide. As the war begins in earnest in November of 1947 and then pushes on into 1948, one nation alone, only one, helped Israel procure equipment to fight. Now think of this, where's the Jewish towns and people and farms going to get weapons to fight a modern war? The British didn't leave any for Israel to use. Czechoslovakia came to the rescue. By the way, let me say that there were many brave new Israelis now on the kibbutzes who worked making weapons underground. So Margalit and I lived on the kibbutz Magad Michael that in the 1940s was making weapons, and they would do it in I think the laundry area of the kibbutz. And so if they ever had a raid of British police coming to inspect, they could easily hide things, as it were, in the dirty laundry. Anyhow, Czechoslovakia had many military equipment parts laying around after World War II, especially aviation ones. And they sold many of these parts and they helped deliver them to the new Jewish state. So modern Israel should really be grateful to the Czechs and the Slovaks for their help of those years. If we ask the question why they helped Israel, I've never really found an answer to that, but we're certainly glad they did. So as the war was progressing, there were agents of the Irgun and the Haganah in Czechoslovakia of then, the Czech Republic of today, who were buying up any spare equipment they could find. They were putting planes together in the Czech Republic that were flown over by Jewish pilots who happened to belong to the Royal Air Force of the UK during World War II. They were volunteering their time in a special unit called the Machal unit in the IDF, which was made up of foreign volunteers. And that's how the planes got to the new Israeli Air Force. And they showed up just in the nick of time to stave off the Egyptian Air Force when it began to attack Tel Aviv. Okay, let's go to the official war. When did it begin? It began on the 15th of May, 1948, the day after independence was declared. Israel was 1 day old, and on day one was attacked on 5 different fronts by 5 Arab armies. The Arab strategy was simple. It consisted of 3 things. Number 1, take Jerusalem. Remember, Ben-Gurion said, if Jerusalem falls, the new state is done with. Take Jerusalem was the strategy. It already was cut off from the rest of the Jewish state by the roadblock that had been set by a number of different Arab forces. So the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was blocked at the Latrun Junction. We're going to look at maps of that in a minute. Okay, secondly, the plan was to split the Galilee off from the central region of the Jewish state, thereby isolating all the Jewish towns and farms in the Galilee, having to fight on their own and not being able to get any help. Thirdly, the plan was to invade Tel Aviv and capture Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. The government would fall, end of the Jewish state. So they tried all 3 of those things, especially concentrating on point number 1, which was taking Jerusalem. Let's talk about the Arab nation's brain trust for a minute. Consisted of King Abdullah of Jordan, who's in the photo before you. Then there was King Farouk of Egypt. Prime Minister El-Khoury was the head of the Lebanese government. Hajj al-Husseini was the Mufti of East Jerusalem, and he was more or less the spiritual guide to the Arab irregulars who fought against Israel, the Arab irregulars who happened to be from Israel. Faisal was the king of Iraq, who sent troops as well into the war, and President al-Kuwaiti of Syria. King Abdullah said that these are 5 heads in a sack. That was his description of all of them, including himself. So he wasn't impressed with their results as the war went on. How about Israel's military leaders? Israel's fledgling leaders were Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. You see him. He's the half-bald guy with bushy hair. Front row, bottom right. Chief of Staff of the IDF was David Mickey Marcus, who was replaced not long afterwards by Yaakov Dori. You'll see him on the far left, the bald man in the military uniform right here, Yaakov Dori. And above him was the famous Chief of Military Operations, General Yigal Yadin, who was perhaps famous for his archaeological career. He's the man on Masada, the dig at Masada that all of us go and visit. He was also a brilliant military strategist, which is why he headed the IDF's Chief of Military Operations Unit. President Chaim Weizmann was another fledgling leader. So these are men who definitely were very important, upfront, and prominent in everything that was being done during the time of the war. Now, let's talk about the battle for Jerusalem. As we've said before, this is going to be the main theater where the war is really decided. At least the Jewish ability to keep going in the war has to be founded upon Jerusalem remaining in Jewish hands. Jerusalem was divided. The eastern part of the city was mostly Arab. There were Jews in what is called the Old City of Jerusalem today, And the western part of the city was fully Jewish. So perhaps Jerusalem was the most emotionally important theater of the war, as well as just strategic location of the war. Again, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion stated, if Jerusalem falls, the state falls. So the war begins again in Jerusalem in November of 1947, before the War of Independence officially is underway. Why? As we mentioned, the Jordanian Legion, which is Jordan's army, and the Arab irregulars, you saw the Sheikh al-Husseini, who was their spiritual leader, understood Begin's point. And so they're thinking, let's head them off at the pass, as we like to say in Arizona. Let's take steps that can preempt having to have a long war. Let's go into Jerusalem, war end. Capture Jerusalem, win the war quickly. That was the hope of the Jordanian Legion. And so they were probably the most formidable of the Arab armies in the war. They were commanded by British, New Zealand, and Australian officers and equipped by the British. They had 20,000 soldiers. So they were tasked with taking Jewish Jerusalem, which is West Jerusalem of today. They failed in that task. However, they did hold East Jerusalem, and they took the Gush Etzion area. As they held East Jerusalem, and the war ends, Jerusalem will be a divided city to East Jerusalem, which belonged to Jordan, and West Jerusalem, which was Israeli. The Jordanian Legion was appalled at how cruel the Arab irregular army with their spiritual leader Sheikh al-Husseini were. And in fact, the Jordanian Legion at times killed a few of the Arab irregulars because of their ungentlemanly practices. Now remember, who trains the Jordanian Legion? The British. The British believed in fighting wars that had a civil part to it. In other words, after you conquer somebody, you take them prisoner of war, and you treat them as prisoners of war. You don't kill them, you don't dismember them, because the Arab irregulars, after they would kill Jews, which they did in Gush Etzion, for example, beheaded and dismembered all of the Jewish corpses. When the Jordanian Legion saw that, they were absolutely turned off by it. And so they captured the irregulars who did that, and they put them on trial and killed them. Anyhow, on we go. The Jordanian Legion and the Arab irregulars together blocked off the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The idea was to cause a starvation siege around the city of Jerusalem, in its, especially from the west, the Jewish part, which the road to Jerusalem was supplying with medical equipment, with food, with other supplies that are needed to live life. Jerusalem was not a self-sustaining city in the western part. So they did this. They began the starvation siege by shutting off the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Their plan was to let the city starve over the winter of 1947 and 1948. And then in 1948, when the people were tired and hungry and dying and full of disease, then the Jordanian Legion would attack the Jewish neighborhoods in the spring. There would be certain surrender, failure of the Jewish effort, fall of the city of Jerusalem, fall of the Jewish state. Get the plan? So this is why the road is cut off. And it was cut off by Arab snipers who are in the hills that you're looking at. And as you drive up Highway 1 today from Tel Aviv toward Jerusalem, you can imagine the setting. This is where it happened. There's snipers on both sides of the road, which happens to be lower than the ridge above it in the Judean hills. And as you're going through it, at the Latrine Junction in particular, which is at the beginning of it, there were heavy machine guns put there by the Jordanian Legion at what was the old police station there, and the monastery, which is there, the Trappist monastery, also in the fields there, had heavy machine guns. And that meant that the road was blocked, cut off, because they could easily shoot, attack, and destroy anything coming up that road to bring help to Jerusalem. So this strategy, by the way, wasn't new. It's like the strategy of King Sennacherib. I forget his English name, Sennacherib or something like that. Sennacherib II of ancient Assyria, when the days of King Isaiah, of the prophet Isaiah, and King Hezekiah sealed off sieged and tried to starve Jerusalem. And then he mounts a final attack against her. That was his plan. It failed, and Sennacherib at the last minute was defeated fully by a miracle from God. So the question you have to ask yourself as you see Jerusalem coming under a siege in 1947 and 1948 is, would another miracle happen? Because that's what it would take, really, with what was brewing, to save Western Jerusalem and therefore save the Jewish state. So again, why was the road shut off from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? This road was the only lifeline between Jerusalem and the rest of the Jewish yeshuv, or community. If pinched off, which it was, snipers again could easily kill anyone trying to arrive in Jerusalem from the heights or hills overlooking the road. And that's what happened. No food, no medicine, no supplies could make it into the Jewish sections of Jerusalem. Now, that didn't mean that people didn't try. If we look at the photo, this is from the winter of 1947. People were trying to get oil and neft. What's a good, neft is kerosene. So oil, kerosene, and even water by rationing. Food was rationed. So this is a line for the Jewish citizens of Jerusalem by which they take their ration coupons and get water, oil, and kerosene for heating. The 100,000 Jewish residents were closed off to the world by the siege that took place and was being very successful. Now, if you ask the question, well, why couldn't they use roads that were to the east or the north? They were dominated by the Jordanian Legion that was holding the area. So this was the only road that had any connection to the rest of the Jewish world. Famine hit the city because of the siege, and it was winter, so it was cold and rainy. Again, this isn't the first time this has happened. We have to remember the Assyrian siege that failed. Would God come through again is the big question we ask. Well, here's what happened. Enter hoops, which is Arabic for bread. It's a plant that we call in English bull mallow. It's a plant that grew crazy wild in the city in the winter of 1947 and 48. And guess what? It's edible. You can eat it. People made soup out of it, and it sustained the city through the winter. God came through with the growth of this plant that people who were there at the time said they never saw grow in the way that it did back then. Please mute yourself if you just joined us so we can not have reverb in our ears here. Again, whoops is the Arabic word for bread, and this whoops plant became the staple food for that winter. There's a photo of it. The Haganah and the Irgun separately and together tried to free the road to Tel Aviv, but failed. I'm getting some really bad reverb in my ears. Could whoever has your mute not on, mute yourself, please? Thank you. Hasn't happened yet. I can't continue until the muting stops. Whoever is not muted, can you please mute yourself? Okay, there it stopped. Thank you. Okay, so the Haganah and the Irgun tried to free the road to Tel Aviv, but they failed. Continual transports were coming up to Jerusalem, up what was called the Sniper Road that we talked about, and they had a 70% failure rate. So many young Haganah and Irgun members were losing their lives, trying to bring transport up the highway in trucks. They were killed by continual sniper fire, by Arab irregulars in the hills that we talked about, as well as by the Jordanian Legion's mortars that they'd shoot down, as well as rifle fire. And the Latrun Junction you would have to pass, there was machine gun fire. The trucks moved very slowly with supplies in them, so it made them a very easy target. Here on the left, you see one supply truck of young Haganah members trying to make it to Jerusalem. Again, 70% of those trucks were hit, burned out, and destroyed. We have memorials to them in Israel today. And on the right, you can see the road that with trucks on them trying to move a convoy of supplies into Jerusalem. 70% failure. People and supplies were destroyed on the Tel Aviv road to Jerusalem. On the upper left hand, we have a photo of one of the trucks that was carrying supplies that was destroyed. It was left there again as a memorial. The bottom picture is a truck that was trying to make its way to Jerusalem. It was hit, destroyed. You can see the Arab irregulars standing around, who probably were amongst those who, it looks like it was hit by some kind of heavy weaponry. But they would come in afterwards. They would drag people out. Most of them were dead if the truck was hit. Those who were alive, they take out as prisoners, and then they would take the supplies as well. The picture on our right here is of Dov Yosef, who was the mayor of Jerusalem during the siege of 1947 and 8. He bravely organized the city to ration supplies during the siege. And again, oil and water and kerosene rationed. He was in charge of doing that. Because of his great organizational skills and his ability to help people rise above the tremendous problems that they were facing, he credited with really helping the spirit of the city remain high enough so people weren't too terribly depressed. Here's the Latrun Monastery and Police Station, or fort, that commanded a strategic view of the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. You can see the soldiers of the Jordanian Legion here. They would be using this gun to shoot down on the trucks that you just saw coming up and anyone else trying to reach Jerusalem. So, next slide here. We know the reason why now that supplies weren't able to get to Jerusalem. However, a brilliant plan freed the road to Jerusalem. From June 2nd to June 10th, 1948, these are the important dates that the plan to break the sniper siege of the road succeeded. And because it succeeded, guess what happens? The city of Jerusalem is spared. What happens when the city of Jerusalem is spared and supplies come to it? The state of Israel lives to see another day. So this is a very important event. There were direct frontal assaults against the Latrun Monastery, where the Jordanian guns were in their fields, and against the police station there where their guns were, and they all failed. Ariel Sharon, some of you might know him, he was later Prime Minister of Israel. He was injured in trying to take the monastery. So with the huge failure rate on the convoys to Jerusalem, there was an alternative plan that was begun, and it was looked at as the only way that this siege could be broken, and the only way the state could survive. This plan was directed by General David Mickey Marcus, who was the first IDF chief of staff, called in Hebrew the Ramatkal. He was, after the IDF was born on the 26th of May, 1948, he immediately went to work as the chief of staff, that is the head general, if you're an American 5-star general, and coming up with a plan to help break the siege. And the bypass plan was called the Burma Road, after the World War II Burma Road that the British actually helped to build. First, a little about General David Marcus, the first chief of staff of the IDF, and I want you to get to know him a little bit because he really is a hero, but a short-lived one. He was an immigrant to Israel from the United States, and a West Point graduate, meaning he had a professional military education as his background. He was General Dwight Eisenhower's assistant during World War II, which made him privy to a lot of good military information and intelligence. Ben-Gurion asked him to come to Israel and lead the coming War of Independence. He agreed, he came. As soon as he got here, he wrote the IDF's first organizational manual used by its officers and used to train them, which is still today the foundation of the IDF. He unfortunately was killed in a friendly fire incident. I'll explain what happened in a minute. He was age 47. He was killed on the 10th of June in 1948, 3 weeks after independence was declared, and basically 3 weeks into his new job as the chief of staff. The genius plan of building the Burma Road was directly under his supervision. So although he was only here for 3 weeks, he got the manual written that was used to help organize the IDF, and he was able to get the Burma Road built, which helped save Jerusalem, which helped save the state. So he accomplished quite a bit in 3 weeks. The very day the Burma Road was completed, he was killed. How did he get killed? He had to go to the bathroom at night. Obviously, there's no toilets there, right? Where he was. He was in a tent just off the Burma Road that was being built. in the Judean hills. He covered himself, it was a cold night in June, he covered himself with a white sheet. An 18-year-old sentry on duty looks at this guy walking around in a white sheet. He thinks he's an Arab terrorist. So he yells at General Marcus, identify yourself, and what's our password? General Marcus did not know one word of Hebrew. He always spoke in English to his officers. So he didn't know what the guy, operationally he did, but he didn't know how to respond back. And so the 18-year-old shot him and killed him. The 18-year-old's colleagues had to do everything they could to stop him from committing suicide after he found out who he had just shot. So it was an accident, an unfortunate one, but thank God that General Marcus was as effective as he was during the time that he was the chief of staff. So the Burma Road plan was this: make another road to Jerusalem that would be built off the main highway, the main road that was occupied by the snipers and the latrine machine guns. Now the challenge would be to build the road, but not let them know about it, somehow to do it incognito. And it was built over a shepherd's footpath known as the Gazelle Path. It bypassed the dangerous latrine junction. The bypass route was quickly built. And again, it's called the Burma Road after the wartime road built by the British. In the photo at the bottom, you can see the challenge of building the road at the steep angle that the road took. Engineering wise, it was really a nice job that the men did. So who built the Burma Road? I mean, how many soldiers would it take to build a road in a week? There were IDF members, obviously, who built it. And guess what? If you were a middle-aged man who was sitting in a cafe or a restaurant in the streets of Tel Aviv, you volunteered to help build that road. And I put volunteered in quotation marks. In other words, the IDF would grab you off your seat and say, come on, you're coming. You're going to help build this road. A lot of the Burma Road was built on the backs of middle-aged men who worked really, really hard. And it must have been very difficult for them to do that heavy labor to build the road. But that's what had to happen, and it did. How was this construction kept secret from the Arab soldiers? Because there were Arab soldiers just maybe a kilometer or two away. And you had to not allow, actually I think it was 3 kilometers away. You had to be able to do it in such a way, if they heard the noise, they would obviously be able to shift forces around and destroy the new road that's being built. And the war's lost. So our IDF members volunteered for what basically were suicide missions, the Jordanian Legion, every single night during the week of June 3rd to June 10th. They made so much noise as they would be attacking up at Latrine that it covered up any noise made by the new road's construction, which was mostly built at night. The Arab forces would congregate around Latrine and happily repel the attacks of these IDF soldiers coming at them. But that gave cover so that the building wouldn't be heard or seen. The Burma Road, if you're interested, if you live, maybe this will be familiar to you. The Burma Road took this route. It started around Kibbutz Harel, crossing Road 38, past Bet Mayer, hooks up at the Shores Junction to the city, which totally bypasses the Latrine Junction. It was a surprise and brilliant piece of engineering and hard labor that got the road open. So by June 10th now, the day that General Marcus is killed, transports arrived in Jerusalem. The IDF then posted soldiers along the new Burma Road, and they could the road because of that. So water, food, medicine, supplies made it into the city from Tel Aviv. The siege was broken. Jerusalem was saved, but General Marcus was killed on the same day. Yaakov Dori, whose photograph we looked at, was appointed as the new Ramkal, the new chief of staff. So the question to be asked was, would General Marcus' death cause the IDF to crumble? And in short, the answer is no, because officers rallied around General Dori, new head, and people such as General Nathaniel Lorch, Yigal Yadin, who we talked about, who was also a general, and other high-ranking officers, such as Moti Alon, Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, Yisrael Galili, Yitzhak Sadeh, Avidon, and Sergeant David Shalel, who I put at the end, very famous because he is going to try. He fought in the French army in World War II. The French Underground Army, had a high rank there, was brought in, and he led the Jewish troops in Jerusalem trying to retake the eastern part of the city. He failed in that, but he was greatly honored for his great efforts, in particular helping the Jewish prisoners of war who were in Jerusalem be able to come to the new state. They were held as prisoners of war by the Jordanians, but their release was negotiated. Now, also part of Jerusalem, not Jerusalem freed, right? In June of 1948, do you think that the Jordanian Legion would stop trying to take the city? The answer is, of course not. That's their main goal and mission in this war, to grab Jerusalem. Instead of doing it by sieging the road, now their plan for the direct attack will come about to be. So, and this actually happened in late May 1948, actually before the Burma Road was opened. The Jordanian Legion decided to attack Jewish Jerusalem and cause it surrender. They had thought the siege had done enough damage. Now's the time to move in and do what they wanted to. So it was the last to destroy the Jewish state by the Jordanian Legion. The siege had been taking place now for 6 months. General John Noam on the left in the drawing was the Jordanian Legion's British commander. He sent an armored unit of 17 vehicles from Ramallah into Jerusalem in order to make the city surrender. How would he do it? The strategy was to park all 17 armored vehicles outside the old city walls of today, around Hebron Road, and let them fire all night long into Mea Sharim. And Mea Sharim is where there was a concentration of Jewish families living, was a Jewish neighborhood. Could you please mute yourself? Was ever not muted. So General Glub expected that there'd be surrender the next morning and that he would gloriously end the War of Independence. But boy, was he in for a surprise. By the way, General Glub and General Marcus were allies during World War II, but now they're enemies. Okay, the success on the road to Jerusalem was a quick end to the siege and starve strategy to win the war. So the Jordanian Legion again is going to try to make Jerusalem fall through a direct armored assault. And you can see, using 17 vehicles like this that had guns that would shoot into Mea Sharim is what the strategy was. You can see what the Jordanian soldiers of the Legion looked like here on our drawings. Next slide. General Glub had convinced British, New Zealand, Australian officers to join him, and they did. By the way, just for our information, General Glub was fired by King Hussein of Jordan in 1956 because he suffered by that time 2 losses to a Jewish army. The failure of the Jordanian Legion's armored unit would be, my opinion, one of the miracle stories of the War of Independence. So I'm going to tell you all about it. The Jordanian Legion had about 20,000 soldiers in its command. In the photo left here, you see members of the Jordanian Legion. This man, him, these two, him, and we have 2 prisoners of the IDF who they captured. On we go. Whoops. The armored vehicles coming down from Ramallah were coming south into Jerusalem. Again, their plan is to park off a Hebron Road of today, turn their turrets toward Mea Sharim, fire all night long. In the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem, which is before you would hit Hebron Road, all 17 vehicles stopped for 2 hours. So the question is, why? The answer is to party. They made it into Jerusalem. They expected no opposition because all the Jewish forces are down on their troon trying to break the siege. All the IDF soldiers were there. Now, when they partied, they happened to injure their highest ranking officer. Whoops, party injury. So they took a while to figure out then who their commander was going to be. By the way, that officer got hit by a mortar shell that somebody accidentally set off during the party. So it took them 2 hours to radio back to Ramallah and have Ramallah tell them who was going to be their commander. This 2-hour reprieve gave time for the IDF to organize a resistance. What a story. I'm going to tell you all about it, as I said. So again, if you think God is behind the scenes here, a 2-hour party in the middle of a military operation is almost unheard of, especially by British trained forces who tend to be very serious. And the British strategy of how to fight a battle is to mobilize and move in the morning. By afternoon, have taken what you need taken and hold it at night. They weren't doing that here. So a day before, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion heard rumors that the Legion was going to attack Jerusalem from Ramallah. So I repeat, one IDF officer was in Jerusalem that day on his honeymoon. The officer was Yosef Nebo, also an American immigrant to Israel. He was cabled by Ben-Gurion. Yosef, that was his first name, go save Jerusalem was the entire cable. Nebo had to concoct a quick plan with no supplies in his hand, with no soldiers under his command, to save the city from this armored assault. Now, on the right here, we see Lieutenant Yosef Nebo, taken obviously many years later. He later became the mayor of the city of Herzliya, Israel. He wasn't a Jerusalemite. So there's the face of a hero. And I can only explain it by saying that with God's help, he did save Jerusalem. And I'll explain to you why I think God's help was in it here. Nebo had heard that there was a local high school that was having an overnight that night of a Gadna unit. Gadna unit was a high school aviation club made up of high school students who were studying aviation. He went into their meeting and he convinced the entire club of 30 students to join him to resist the Jordanian Legion. The average age of a Gadna member of these high school students was about 16. So 30 16-year-olds and this lieutenant are going to defend Jerusalem against the Jordanian Legion. Nebo took his 30 high schoolers. He was joined by someone named Moshe Rabinowitz, who was a former Red Army weapons expert during World War II, now living in Israel, and now an IDF member, and someone named Pinchas the Strong. This almost sounds like a cartoon, doesn't it? Pinchas the Strong, who also happened to be an American immigrant and happened to own a machine gun. He was in Jerusalem for some reason. So they found each other, they joined together, and they began to make Molotov cocktails like crazy. The city was rationing kerosene and oil, so they sent all the students to local stands for kerosene with bottles that they could find along the way and filled them all up and made Molotov cocktails, thousands of them, in a number of hours. Moshe Rabinowitz, who I just mentioned, the Russian immigrant to Israel, had been injured, and so he was in the Bikur Cholim hospital recovering from his injury, but Nebo fished him out of there. And Moshe Rabinowitz happened to be a bazooka expert. He happened to have a bazooka with him in the hospital, and he happened to have 5 shells with it. So even though he wasn't feeling very well, he had his hand blown off. Rabinowitz taught one of the high school students how to fire a bazooka, and now the miracle simply had to happen, or it was the fall of the young state. Either these 30 kids with the 3 soldiers had to stand and win, or the state falls. Could the high school students under Lieutenant Nebo somehow, some way, beat the professional Jordanian Legion? You see how high the stakes were. The existence of the new Jewish state depended upon it. Nebo had to guess the correct route by which the Legion was coming so he could figure out the correct place to put everybody to ambush them. There were only 2 possibilities, but he couldn't guess wrong or he would lose. Would the Legion pounce upon the Mea Shearim neighborhood from the Sanhedria neighborhood, which is directly north of Mea Shearim? So it would be a direct attack from the north, or would they pounce upon Mea Shearim, shooting at them from the east, from Derek Hebron, Hebron Street of today, which is a direct attack from the east? Well, you already know, I told you which one. And Yosef guessed correctly. He guessed they would line up their armored pieces on Derek Hebron and fire, and he guessed correctly. As it says in Psalm 37, the steps of a good man are ordered by Adonai. It was Molotov cocktails, a bazooka held by a high school student. The students were all on foot, by the way. And some of them were in a building right where the ambush was going to take place. There was a building standing there, a house of a Dr. Mandelbaum. So they climbed up high, 2 stories up. And they were going against 17 armored vehicles and a professionally trained group of infantry and vehicle operators. Whom would you think should win that battle? That's why I pictured it as David against Goliath. However, surprise was on the side of Lieutenant Naval. He prepared his attack quickly, and it was totally unexpected. Remember I said the Jordanian Legion knew that all the Jewish soldiers were at Lichun. They didn't expect any resistance. Attack him where he is unprepared, appear where you're not expected, said Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese warlord, in his book, The Art of War. And that's exactly the thing that led to the success of Yosef Nego's surprise attack. The battle took place here. I took a photo of this maybe a month ago. This is Derek Hebron. You see the white car is traveling on Derek Hebron at St. Mark Street. This cross street here is St. Mark Street. Here is where the battle took place. The 1st Legion armored vehicle is coming this direction from the north, and he made a mistake. He wasn't supposed to turn left into St. Mark Street, but he did. So he makes this turn like this, and right here is where the young man with the bazooka was positioned. The lead vehicle went right into the sights of his bazooka. He couldn't miss. And boom, it was a bullseye hit. And to quote Dominic Lapierre and Gary Collins from their book, O Jerusalem, they chronicle the history of this battle. All hell broke loose upon that hit. There was a hail of Molotov cocktails rained down on all 17 vehicles by the students who were up above on the Mandelbaum house. Those vehicles that were too far away to be hit by them were attacked by the 30 students on foot. And in the bazooka hit, I think the first 3 vehicles all blew up and caught on fire, and that included most of the officers who were there. So the Jordanian Legion vehicles found themselves leaderless. They had no strategy. They didn't really know where they were. It's their first time in this part of Jerusalem. So they all fled into the old city. They didn't want to fight. They made a beeline there, and the battle was quickly over. A number of the students were pretty badly injured, but as Collins and Lapierre write in their book chronicling the battle, they were so full of adrenaline, they just kept running after the Jordanian Legion soldiers. So the result is Jewish Jerusalem was saved by this one battle. And the official Jordanian Legion's log for that day, their diary said this: our armored vehicles met stiff resistance, unexpected, so they let off the attack. And that's all they said about it. Obviously, it would be an extremely embarrassing defeat for General John Glubb. So that's what he chose to write about it. And it was then decided that the Legion would never engage the Jews further in urban warfare, but only out in the open. That's what the official report of the Jordanian Legion said. At left, our photo is of Nomi Nevo, the young bride, on her honeymoon in her parents' apartment in Jerusalem. She burst into tears when a messenger came to tell her, Nomi, Yosef saved Jerusalem. She was actually expecting Nomi. Yosef bravely gave his life in defense of the state. But that's what you got to hear. And if you don't think God's hand was on that battle, look at everything that had to happen for the Lieutenant Naval and his Jewish high schoolers to win, and it all happened. Wrong turns, 2-hour stops for a party. The lead officer gets injured and is taken out of the coming battle because of his injury. It was just a full line of coincidences that had to come together. So by mid-June 1948, the battle for Jerusalem is basically over. The keys to victory were the Burma Road being built, repelling the Jordanian Legion 17 vehicle attack, and frightening the Jordanian Legion from ever engaging in the city of Jerusalem in urban warfare again. Thirdly, a third thing that had to happen was to drive out the Iraqi and Egyptian troops who were in the Talpiot and Baka neighborhoods of Jerusalem. And the IDF did this via something called the Davidka. And again, if this doesn't make you believe in God, I don't know what does. Here is a photo of the Davidka. It's a memorial today sitting on Davidka Square in Jerusalem. Okay, next slide. Jewish Jerusalem was now safely in the state of Israel. All of Jewish Jerusalem, that was west of Hebron Road, that was. The Baka and Talpiot neighborhoods, who had a lot of Jewish families living there, were basically up for grabs. There were Iraqi and Egyptian troops there, as I said, plus some Jordanian legionnaires. The IDF then decided how those neighborhoods were going to be won and become part of Jewish Jerusalem. And they spread word of something, that they had a secret weapon called the Davidka. And this was part of what the IDF called Operation Kilshon, which means pitchfork, get those Arab armies out of there. What they did, the Davidka looked like a nasty kind of artillery weapon, but it was a worthless noise-making fake weapon. It made a huge boom when it was lit, and word was spread by Jews in those neighborhoods that the IDF was dropping atom bombs in Baka and Talpiot. And the Arab soldiers had never seen or heard much of an Arab bomb, and they were so frightened by the prospect of having an atom bomb dropped on them that they just fled. All three of those armies fled out of those neighborhoods, at least. And so again, those neighborhoods were freed. And what it did is it gave time to some of the Jewish families who were trapped. There were a couple of areas in those neighborhoods that still had more Arab families than Jewish ones, and the Jewish ones would be in danger if they stayed there. This gave them time to get out of their apartments and flee into west of Hebron Road. So in June of 1948, Jerusalem now is divided into two sectors, and the first truce began on the 11th of June, ending formal conflict in Jerusalem. And so the dividing line became Hebron Road, East and West Jerusalem. These other neighborhoods that were south, Bakan, Talpiot, part of it is in Israeli hands. Part of it, starting out at Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, that you might be aware of, were in Jordanian hands. And so the border was not a clearly delineated one. You just had to know where you were. God's hand of deliverance in that story. Adonai Almighty will shield Jerusalem. He will shield it and deliver it. He will pass over it and rescue it. That's Isaiah chapter 31, verse 5. And then Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8. For he, Adonai, said, anyone who harms you, meaning Jerusalem, harms my most precious possession. Did God really shield and deliver Yaakov's descendants in Jerusalem as this battle occurred? We can ask somebody who was actually there, the Bar David family. As I mentioned, Jewish civilians had to leave Jerusalem for about 19 years and flee out of parts of Bakan Talpiot till the IDF had one there. In 1967, these neighborhoods were fully incorporated under one Jewish Jerusalem. So let me tell you the Bar David story was related to me and told by Aryeh Bar David, whose photo you see on the right. He stated this. He and his family during the War of Independence lived in the a section of the Talpiot neighborhood. An Arab gang was armed with pistols. They went street to street in Talpiot and beat up, sometimes killed Jewish family heads and drove us out of those areas. Abu George was the name of the local gang leader. One day, Abu George and some friends came to the home of the Bar David family. Abu George pointed his pistol at Aryeh's father, who was already on the street trying to get away with his entire family following after him. I remember in the story, he had blankets and pillows on his back because he was trying to flee to West Jerusalem, just get out of there safely and bring the bedding so at least they had something to sleep on. Abu George approached and trapped Mr. Bar David, that would be Aryeh's father, and then he suddenly looked beyond him with his eyes, looked beyond Mr. Bar David, and quickly Abu George and his cohorts fled in a quick, huge panic, leaving the entire Bar David family alone and able to proceed to safety in West Jerusalem. What happened? Aryeh Bar David said to me, I think he saw an angel, and he was very serious about that. So again, was God there helping? I truly believe he was. The family made it safely to the Mea Sharim neighborhood, and they lived there for the duration of the war. So Jerusalem status for 19 years was decided. Now the battle for Tel Aviv, where Prime Minister Ben-Gurion was living then. You know, it took a miracle as well to save Tel Aviv. And so it happened on May 19th through 24th, 1948. The miracle takes place. Now, if you get your dates together in the mind, at the same time this is happening is basically the same time that the battle was just beginning to wind down in Jerusalem. So it's like one miracle on top of another to save the borders of the country. There was a battle at a kibbutz called Yad Mordechai that saved Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, here's a map of Yad Mordechai. Tel Aviv, if we keep going north on the 4 road and we go, I don't know, another 45, 50 kilometers further north, we'd run into the Tel Aviv area. So Yad Mordechai was a kibbutz on the Gaza border founded by Polish Jews who escaped World War II or had survived the Shoah, the Holocaust. Why was the kibbutz so famous? 150 kibbutz members made a stand against an 8,000 strong Egyptian army thrust, whose aim it was to conquer Tel Aviv. A mere 65 kilometers away, these kibbutzniks, these kibbutz members, had to hold the Egyptians off for 5 days until the IDF could get some soldiers to the Tel Aviv area to defend it. It was a race for time, and kibbutz Yad Mordechai happened to be on the road from Egypt to Tel Aviv. That was their misfortune in a way. In another way, it was the fortune of the state of Israel. They were there. It's all about location, location, location. Here's kibbutz Yad Mordechai, and you can see Egypt is here. The Egyptian army came up the Gaza Strip, was going to go around Yad Mordechai and road number 4, up through here, and Tel Aviv is around here. It's easy entry into Tel Aviv. If all they have to do is go straight. There was no IDF resistance on the way. So Yad Mordechai's location made it the center point for the battle for Tel Aviv, which the Arab Brain Trust entrusted to the Egyptian army, arguably the most powerful one in the Arab War, along with the Jordanian Legion. So that's what it looks like. That was the location factor here. Now, the Egyptian strategy was to march right up to road number 4. And you saw Yad Mordechai is just to the left. It's basically on road number 4, just a teeny bit to the left of it, to the west. So the Egyptian strategy is to just go right up to road number 4, shell the tarnation, that means the daylights, out of the kibbutz, and just capture it as spoils along the road to Tel Aviv. They didn't think it would take them any time at all. That wasn't going to happen. The kibbutzniks understood how crucial they were to winning the war. The women voted to stay and fight alongside the men. So they took all the children on the kibbutz and evacuated them to another kibbutz that was a bit of a distance away and off the road on a daring night escape. And the women stayed with their husbands. The entire Egyptian force of 8,000 stopped just outside Yad Mordechai, and they shelled it and followed it up with an infantry assault. Guess what? The infantry assault failed. The few kibbutzniks held off wave after wave, actually, of infantry attacks on the 19th and 20th of May. If you go to kibbutz Yad Mordechai, they have the fields where the Egyptians infantry came with some armored vehicles set up as if it was a battlefield, the battlefield from back then. So if you're looking out like at this bottom photo, it's as if you're in the trench at Yad Mordechai looking out at what you would have seen on May 19th and 20th, 1948. any number of times. This is what the fields looked like. Egyptian soldiers coming and coming and coming. You can take a look and see what happened to the main water tower of the kibbutz. It got shelled. You can see the pock marks there. It never did fall, so they left it up as a memorial. Now the weather helped the kibbutzniks. Again, who causes weather to happen, right? The kibbutzniks hurriedly dug a trench around the kibbutz so that they could walk and carry things to each other and be able to get around the kibbutz. They manned spots on the trench with fighters. A thick fog enveloped the entire area on the day that the Egyptians arrived. So the Egyptians brought their first assault wave. They brought soldiers to the barbed wire that was on the outside of the kibbutz. And I don't know why, but they only gave these soldiers wire cutters. They were supposed to go, wire cut, bring down the barbed wire fences and go back. And then in would come the infantry attack. The soldiers only had wire cutters, no arms. The fog suddenly lifted, and that entire first wave was quickly neutralized. All the assailants were killed because they had no weapons. They were just given wire cutters. Who lifts fog? Not you and I. Eventually, a day or two later, an assault did penetrate the kibbutz, but the few kibbutzniks who were left by that time fought off the attackers and drove them back. Why? You have the element of motivation. The kibbutzniks said as they defended the kibbutz, they could tell that the Egyptian soldiers, who they might have captured or faced, even in some hand-to-hand fighting in some of the barns at the kibbutz, they said that the Egyptian soldiers just want to get out of there. They had no motivation for being there, really. So oftentimes they exchange shots at each other, and then the Egyptian soldiers would just go back. Okay, anyhow, this defeat so shocked the officers of the Egyptian army that they stopped the entire march to Tel Aviv, and they wired back to Cairo to Central Command headquarters and asked, what do we do? And it took another day before they got their answer. So their answer was level the kibbutz, destroy it. But that wasn't going to be so easy. And now an entire day and a half was going on to 2 days. This kind of stalling is what helped save Tel Aviv, because the IDF was quickly getting organized to get soldiers down to the southern part of Tel Aviv to oppose the Egyptian army here. So there was an incredible outcome. 26 of the 150 defenders died. And yet probably double that amount were wounded. Yet the kibbutz held the Egyptians up, not 1 day, not 2 days, not 3 days, not 4 days, for 5 entire days and part of a 6th. The survivors of the kibbutz were out of ammunition, out of food, they were exhausted. And after day 5, at night, everybody fled the kibbutz and made it to another kibbutz safely. The Egyptians hung around for another half day before discovering that everybody was gone. So dawn breaks and morning comes of day 6, and they didn't even know the kibbutzniks were gone. So their stay stalled. This was enough time for the IDF to get reinforcement into Tel Aviv by day 6. So the Egyptians were stopped in their plans to capture Tel Aviv after a fight with the IDF that did take place just north of the kibbutz. An American military officer visiting Yad Mordechai after the War of Independence was over said this: I could have taken this entire kibbutz with just one company of men, that's like 30 men, in 1 hour. And look what happened. Again, there is no logical reason the Egyptians should have fought the way they did and were beaten. The 5 days of stalling of the Egyptian army gave the IDF its needed time to muster the force and beat off the Egyptians in the Ashdod area, at the area called Ad Halom, and Tel Aviv was saved. And there you see the trench that was dug, along with the spots that were manned. And you can look on the field outside and see tin and paper facsimiles of Egyptian soldiers that are standing up in the field. And that would have been what the view would have been like for a defender of the kibbutz, approximately as it's reconstructed by the kibbutzniks. The trench and guns of the kibbutzniks on the left that we see are those that fended off the waves of infantry attack. The kibbutznik strategy was this: identify their officers if you can and shoot at them. They'll run if they lose their officers. This was Gelman, the kibbutz defender, as he described the strategy. Colonel Sarig, who was an IDF high-ranking officer, went to the survivors of the kibbutz after the battle was over, and here's what he said to them: "It's so good to see you. We didn't think you'd make it out of the bombardment that you went through." By the way, as all of this is happening, the kibbutz is constantly being bombarded. They said, the kibbutzniks, as they were walking in the trench, you couldn't see more than a couple feet in front of your face because there was so much dust in the air from the shells hitting and kicking up dust. My reaction: God brings victory. It's easy for many to be delivered into the hands of a few. Heaven sees no difference in gaining victory through many or through a few, because victory does not lay in the weight of numbers, but rather strength comes from heaven. That's from the book of First Maccabees, chapter 3. And we have the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 7, which states this: but for this to happen, God has to be present there. Adonai will grant that the enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. They'll come at you from one direction, but flee from you in 7. Okay, so there's questions we have to answer when we think about this. How do 130 kibbutzniks, some of them didn't even have weapons, fight off a trained force of thousands who have artillery equipment? Secondly, how does the Egyptian army not see there's no one defending the kibbutz for an entire day? Day 6. Thirdly, why did the Egyptians halt, then continually radio back to Cairo for all their instructions, making their movement a very lengthy process? Why didn't the officers who were amongst them decide what to do? So, next, how does the weather suddenly change to benefit the kibbutz defenders? And next, why didn't the Egyptians simply pass up the kibbutz and continue on to Tel Aviv? Why did they stop to begin with? 150 people were not going to be able to defeat them. Maybe they were afraid that they'd give intelligence information on them. I don't know. But all I know is that it seems to be the entire stopping at Yad Mordechai was something they didn't really need to do, but they did. Okay, Tel Aviv is secure. Jerusalem's secure. Now the battle for Galilee. There was a very simple strategy by the Syrians. The Syrians and the Lebanese were given the job of winning the finger of the Galilee, which is the furthest north stretch of Galilee, and what today is the Israeli side. Well, back then was the Israeli side of the Sea of Galilee, or the Kinneret, the western side of it. So the strategy was simple: that Syria's forces would enter Israel from the Golan Heights, right under the Kinneret. Here's the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. So here's the Golan Heights. The Syrian forces were going to come like this, underneath, and move west in order to divide the land there. Then they again move westward to the Samach Junction of today and destroy everything in their paths till they reach the Mediterranean, thereby cutting the infant state in half. Good plan. And Syria was entrusted by the Arab armies to do that, and they miserably failed. At 2 sites in Galilee, at Kibbutz Gesher on the 15th of May and Kibbutz Degania on the 20th of May, there are Jewish victories against the Syrian and irregular forces. Operation Erez on the 28th and 30th of May secured the Galilee, at least up until the first ceasefire. Kibbutz Ein Gev on the shores of the southwest side of the Sea of Galilee, of the Kinneret, was captured by Syria, but it was rescued by the IDF a day before the ceasefire on the 10th of June. Remember the 10th of June, that's when General Marcus dies, when the Burma Road is open, and now when basically all the Jewish towns in Galilee were secured by the IDF. So just a quick history of Galilee. Syrian forces invaded on these dates and were repulsed. Iraqi and irregular troops kept up the attacks, but didn't succeed ever in gaining any permanent footholds. That was important. The Galilee was attacked from time to time, but even if something was captured, like Kibbutz Ein Gev, usually the IDF got it back within a short amount of time. June 11th was the ceasefire, and the Galilee was pretty much in Jewish hands by that time. On July 8th, the war resumes. The first ceasefire is over. And guess what? The IDF used the ceasefire timing to re-equip, to reman, to replan, to re-strategize, and that really helped. The Arab forces there didn't do the same. I mean, after all, the Syrian army, their strategy-making people are in Damascus, and they didn't go back to Damascus during this time to try and re-strategize. They were kind of left off on an island. So Israel took advantage of the ceasefire to acquire weapons, to build up its ammunition and equipment stores, to actually acquire an air force, and making all this made victory more certain, including in Galilee. The Syrians did not rearm, they didn't re-strategize, they didn't regroup during the ceasefire, which gave the advantage over to the IDF. The second ceasefire takes place on July 18th. And in that 10-day period, the IDF just strengthened what it had already taken and won in the Galilee, so that the Galilee was never really seriously threatened after that. In summary, nothing in Galilee that was attacked by Syria did they gain permanently. And you can see the Syrians, the Iraqis, and the irregulars made thrusts into Galilee, captured some sites, but they could not hold them. And so Galilee was in Jewish hands, period, by the time of the second ceasefire. And the Galilee was secured now and became a permanent part of the new state. Lastly, and this will be our last portion that we're going to cover. I'm sorry, I'm going to go over a little bit. If you have to go, I understand. If you want to stay till the bitter end, you're very welcome. The war in the Negev was the last part of the war to be waged. The Negev was controlled partially by the IDF, but also the Egyptian and Jordanian armies had military outposts there, and that threatened the new Jewish state. So Operation Yoav takes place in October of 1948. The goal was to drive a wedge between the Egyptian forces along the Mediterranean coast and the Beersheba-Jerusalem road, which was important to the new Jewish state. If successful, if the road is secured, the entire Negev was to be taken by the IDF. And that eventually does happen. In October of 1948, the city of Beersheba is taken by the IDF from Egypt. Margalit, I don't know if you remember this building right here. I do. When we lived in Beersheba, it's still up today. The Beersheba was the main base in the Negev region for Egypt. Beersheba controlled all the roads in the northern Negev. So on November 6, 1948, were the end of operations, and the northern and central Negev were completely under control of the IDF. Egypt's forces were cut off from each other. They had no more communication with each other, so they surrendered and withdrew back into Egypt. Only one more objective remained in the entire war, and it was to clear the entire southern Negev down to the Red Sea of all the Egyptian outposts that were there. So our next slide will deal with the final stage or theater of the war, which was Operation Uvda, which took place from the 5th to the 10th of March in 1949. The War of Independence did last that long. IDF forces went on a two-pronged offensive through the Negev. You see the arrows here marking the two prongs. Starting at Beersheba, the army splits off and clears out Egyptian outposts in the Negev, the southern Negev, and meets up in Eilat at the Red Sea. And that's what happened. Jordanian and Egyptian outposts were cleared out successfully by the Golani and Negev brigades. They met up at Eilat, successfully clearing out the enemy forces, captured the Red Sea port, and that's why today you can take vacations in Eilat. From November 1947 to March 1949, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Galilee, and the Negev are secured. The IDF grows in its operational capability, helped by Mahal units, those are foreign volunteers, and newly acquired equipment from Czechoslovakia. The Israeli Air Force began its life, and they began to patrol the skies over Israel, securing the nation from the Egyptian Air Force, which had previously bombed Tel Aviv. So the nation was born and lived on. Again, 1% of Israel's population, 6,000 persons, die in the war. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if your population is only 650,000, it's a heavy price to pay. My final comments. Whoop. The war was a tremendous military upset. There were 6 armies against 1. A brand new country with 650,000 people against nations combined with a 40 million person population. There were 5 fronts to the war. So why did Israel win? A quick analysis, why numbers 1, 2, and 3 are God, God, and God. I'll start with number 4. 30,000 IDF soldiers had experience with the British military during World War II. So that kind of military background certainly helped. The IDF was better organized with better communication lines than the Arab armies we faced. 6, the Israeli Air Force got off the ground and defended our airspace successfully. Number 7, the victories in Jerusalem and at Yad Mordechai. What can you say? That's part of reasons 1, 2, and 3. 8, the Mahal units were very, very influential. Foreign volunteers, these 3 men right here, who are 3 of the best pilots in the Israeli Air Force, 2 of the 3 of them were Mahal volunteers, meaning they were trained pilots, one serving either in the British Air Force or the American Air Force or even the Canadian one during World War II. They came and they helped out with their skills by training Israeli pilots and by also offering their own skills in battle. 9th reason why Israel succeeded, the short-lived health of General Marcus. I think his influence was highly successful. And then number 10, the motivation factor. Jews lose, we die. That's the end of our state. If the Arabs lose, they were just conscripted into the army. They didn't have the high motivation. Stopping the Jews isn't as high a motivation as surviving. And I think we find that during the war that becomes great in motivation. The people at Yad Mordechai even said that. They had greater motivation than any of their attackers. In the photograph, by the way, Gideon Lichtman is the Mahal pilot who single-handedly defeated the Egyptian Air Force during the war. You see him standing there. So there are many stories about individual acts of tremendous courage. Other reasons, I mentioned this, during the first ceasefire, the IDF planned more strategy, bought lots of equipment, got ready to pounce on what was needed for security after the ceasefire was lifted. The Arab armies took the ceasefire to rest, so they weren't gaining any ground. We remember our national anthem, our hope is not yet faded. To be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. So as I end, I don't have a hat on, but I tip my hat in honor and thankfulness to those who gave their lives in combat during the War of Independence. They gave their lives so we who are in the land can live today. Especially want to give a salute to General Marcus for his invaluable help. So if anyone's still left, I can't see if anyone is, but feel free to ask questions or make comments. I'll hang around for a couple more minutes. You can just unmute yourself.
Hey, this was really, really exciting talk, David Friedman. And if can I share one quick thing? Would that be okay?
Please.
Yeah. So 1 year for the Independence Day activities, about maybe 20 years ago, we went on they were doing a hike along the Burma Road, and it was in the path of the 36, I guess, is that? And they took us up, we drove through and we were down in the Ella Valley, which is part of where this 36, who were people who tried to also help with the breaking through to save Jerusalem, were there. And the Brickners, Avi and Leah Brickner, were with us. And there was an older 2 couples that were also walking in this outing, on Independence Day. And the Brickners asked the one couple, older couple in their maybe 60s, I don't know. They said, "Oh, so how come you came on this hike?" And the one man said, "Well, my wife hasn't been back here since she was captured by the Jordanians. And she just thought she'd like to come on this hike and see what it looks like now." And it's so amazing. These little old grandpa people, and they were the ones that did the things, all the things that you've been sharing about. And I just, I know it's your talk and I don't want to take more time, but I have a number of these little sharing things that maybe one day I'll share with you, David, and you can
It'd be great.
Include them. Just
It'd be great.
touching moments,
They really are. Thank you, Martha. By the way, one of the big advantages of the Israeli school system, if you happen to be our children's age, is that they got to meet people who actually took part in all these operations and whatnot, people like Martha's talking about, including our sons who met some people who shared stories that were just beyond anything I could believe, but they really did happen and they're true. Anyone else? Comment, question? Please identify yourself and then let me know.
This is one other quickie. Where we lived in Malcha, I understood that the last battle for Jerusalem was in Malcha, but I don't know the date or anything. But the whole last battle of Jerusalem happened in our neighborhood of Malcha. You lived there too.
Right, that could well be because it was moving around in that direction, yeah. Thank you.
From India, Pune. Thank you, brother. We were very, very touched, very moved by the details because we have read books. I have read so many books, particularly a book by Daniel Garde, something like that. Daniel, the history of Israel and how it took shape. So that itself had moved me a lot. But these sort of details that you have given today, and obviously it's almost firsthand, very touching. It'll go deep down and like a seed in our lives to grow into a tree. Take it to the next generation. Take it to the people here. I was very moved, very touched, and very impressed, very blessed, I should say. My entire family.
Thank you, Pastor Sonny. Appreciate you. I'm going to stay here for 6 more minutes. So if you want to say something, now's your time. Maybe since no one's talking, I can just share a quick story. I met a man through my sons.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Yeah, my question, hi, I'm Noam.
Yes, I'm here.
I want to ask you, is there a book or two that you would recommend, the name of the book and the author, that would cover a lot of the stories you've been sharing?
I'll recommend 2 books that I really love. One is called 6 Days at Yad Mordechai, which tells the story of the kibbutz that held off the Egyptian army, written by an English woman named Margaret Larkin, Larkin. I don't know if it's still in print, but that's a very good book telling some very touching stories of heroism. And a second one is called O Jerusalem by Larry Collins, a Canadian author. And it talks about the Battle of Jerusalem it's not a dry history, it's stories that people told him, who he interviewed about the fighting in Jerusalem. So it's their stories that he tells us. Also very good. I'd recommend those 2. And that book, O Jerusalem, you can find on Amazon.com. It's still being printed and sold. It was a bestseller.
Thank you.
Oh, David, what's the book that tells about when I think Golda Meir, somebody went and got the money to help for
Golda
the army?
did, yes. Yeah, she did. She raised over $1 million. I'm not sure what the book is about that.
Oh, okay, because I remember
I don't think
reading
I,
that.
probably a very good one.
Sunny is holding up a copy of the Book of O Jerusalem.
Ah, wonderful. There you go. Yes.
Karen, I see your mouth moving, but I think you're muted if you wanted to say something.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Sunny.
All right, all right. I would suggest that we make a repeat of this entire evening in the very near future, because I will involve more people who are with us and who need to hear this, so that we get updated that this is not history of the world of Genesis onwards, but this is contemporary times.
Mm.
So if the rabbi would consider this,
I'm willing. Sure. I'm willing. Yes.
It's
so
also being
we can,
recorded, so the recording can be shared.
but it's nothing like hearing it
That's true.
live.
That's true.
That makes a lot of difference, because
Okay,
expressions and comments make such a difference, and it came out so well.
that's
So,
true.
Mm.
Thank you.
so we can work on it, put it to prayer.
Sure. Happy to do that. Anybody else? Any comments or questions?
I would recommend this book about Ezer Wiseman, On Eagle's Wings. His
Right.
his story is so fascinating about his contribution to and of creating the Israeli Air Force. Fascinating book. And the second one I have in my hand, I read a few years ago, called The Pledge. All kinds of things, how they had nothing, but individuals around the world were helping. They were developing the Uzi machine gun, for example, and it talks about bringing those planes in from Czechoslovakia and so on. So The Pledge and On Eagle's Wings, great reads.
Two great books.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Marguerite and I, when we lived here on the kibbutz 40 years ago, had opportunity to work with a lot of people who fought in the War of Independence. And when you meet them and you hear some of whatever part of the stories they're willing to tell, you meet a generation that really is no longer alive in Israel today. And we really don't understand the great contribution that they gave and what kind of heroism it took just to
And the
live life.
sacrifices were great.
Yes, absolutely. It's also kind of unknown, but a number of Holocaust survivors, upon reaching Israel's shores and like after the war from 1945 to 1948, their kind of baptism by fire into Israel, as soon as they hit Haifa port, they were conscripted into the Israeli army, didn't know a word of Hebrew. Many of them had never held a gun, leave alone fire one. And immediately they're brought to a battlefront, not able to understand the orders they're given, have no idea really how to fight. And 300 such people were killed at one of the assaults at Latrun, trying to break the siege of the road to Jerusalem. A lot of stories like that are not known or are forgotten. It was so desperate here at that time that any and everything was tried, and every sacrifice that was made by people, which many of them seem just so incredible, it was do or die. You had to do that. So they did. And it's kind of unlike today, but back then, Jews who believed radically different things about how the state of Israel and the world should be run put down all their differences in order to defend the state. And I guess it's still that way today. But it's heartening, actually, to be able to see people who basically hate each other, like some of the Haggadah Irgun did, put away their differences and join together, and reach the birth of a homeland for the first time in 2,000 years. And again, I just can't help but saying all of this would be impossible unless God would have had his hand on it. I really see his hand on it. Even though we still had to shed blood and shed others' blood and suffer, the state of Israel came about to be like almost no other state in the modern world today.
Debbie, could I say a word here about that?
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
One of the best stories I heard about this whole thing that you're talking about is on the 29th of November, when the United Nations voted for partition. The first Dead Sea Scrolls were purchased for the would-be state of Israel, and among which was the only complete Isaiah scroll. So I think God was speaking directly to modern Israel by giving us, through the prophet Isaiah, that scroll.
Thank you. What a wonderful point. And in his book about the scrolls, Yagal Yadin, the archaeologist who was one of the people who helped decipher the Dead Sea Scrolls, he said basically that he was traditional. He wasn't a real religious man, but he said he believed that the hand of God was on the finding of those scrolls. So he would agree with you, Ariel. Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I hope you enjoyed the history. There's so much more to it. I'm just a messenger. I really, really respect the men and women who gave their lives in order to make sure that the state would be founded. So, my hat's off to them. And as we observe Yom HaZikaron, which is our Memorial Day here this week, we honor those 23,400 Israeli soldiers and police and security workers who have died in conflict. That's what I think about. I think it's on their backs that I'm here. And I'm just very grateful for each and every one of them. And as we celebrate our Independence Day, which is the day after our Memorial Day Yom HaZikaron, I too think about people like David Marcus and, him coming here from the same place I came here from. And he gave his life, even though it was an accident in which he died. In his short life here, he contributed so much. And my prayer is that we, as believers, whatever days God gives us here, can contribute the same in the ways that he gives us to do so. So to me, he's very much an example of, what it is I want my life to be like in that way. Well, thanks for joining. Everybody have a great, it's evening here, whatever time it is where you are, have a great continuation of the day. God bless all of you. It's my privilege to share this, and I hope we can do it again.
And there's a lot of people asking about the recording. Whoever gave you the link to get on should be able to get the recording to you if you're not on our usual list. So make sure you contact whoever it was, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of the video.
If it will encourage the rabbi to hear this, out of the 46 people who joined, participants, about 20 were from our prayer group in Pune and connected to our prayer group, almost 50%. So,
Wonderful.
And perhaps the next time it would be more, God willing. So I hope that encourages you.
It does. And, we shared last night as well, you and I, with the others from TJC too, but we really appreciate believers in India who love Israel. We really do, and appreciate what you're doing. You and your son, your entire family. Thank you. Well, with that, I'm going to have supper. So God bless you all.
Yeah, God bless. Shalom Aleichem from us
Shalom,
all,
shalom.
to all of you.
Shalom,
Shalom, shalom. Bless you. Thank you for joining.
Happy Independence Day. Chag Sameach to
Yeah.
everybody in
Chag
Yes,
Israel.
Sameach.
happy Independence Day to Israel.
Thank
Yes,
you.
And
God
Thank
all
bless.
of
you.
all of you there, from us here,
Thank
Christian.
you.
Shalom. Shalom to all. Shalom to all.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom,
Wonderful.
shalom.
Hello, Margaret.
Hi.
Hello.
Erev Tov.
Erev
Shalom,
tov.
Bracha.
Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.